Hi, my name is Dr. Deanne Ross. I'm the love theorist. As a result of having an interest in love on all levels, from my interpersonal relationships with everybody I meet, to my family life, to my work life, it also brings me to some really troubling concerns where there is a lack of love, or what Bell Hooks calls lovelessness. So today's topic is about bullying in the workplace. And I know as soon as I say that word, people will already be anxious about what it means and what we're going to talk about, because it is a really charged word and it can mean different things to different people. But the bottom line is it can feel really bad if you're the person being bullied. And I want to talk about it. I want to talk about how each of us might be experiencing it, or even being the people causing the bullying, whether we know it or not. And especially for people who have power over other people in a hierarchy at work is a classic example. Issues like vertical violence, that is from the higher order level of the hierarchy to people under you, if you're a supervisor or a boss, can be really hard to recognize. Something can feel really bad, and it can be really hard, even if you recognize it, to know what to do about it. And the harm can just be so hidden and ongoing. And it can also be really subtle. That's what I mean about hidden. So what we come to here are many different types of bullying. And today I want to particularly focus on the issue of backbiting. Another word for it would be gossip or rumor making. So some places in Australia actually have legislation making it illegal to gossip at work because it's recognised to be so harmful. It's harmful to people's reputations, that is for the person who's being talked about in a negative way, and it's also harmful for the people doing the talking about the absent person. Like it is not good for our hearts to be negative about other people, and it might be it's a cold comfort, really, to think in talking some level of gossip or making a negative comment about someone. For the moment, we might feel important and be saying and sharing something interesting to make ourselves more part of the group, especially if we're filling out the work group ourselves. But it's all a folly, and actually keeps adding to what one of my favourite authors, Sandra Bloom, talks about as negative spirals in the workplace, a kind of tit for tat. Yeah. So if you've been hurt by someone, you don't feel safe to talk to them about it, and there may be good reasons for that. Usually is. So in the absence of also an environment where people talk straight and safely with each other, it can be hard for you to be the only person trying to have those direct conversations. And in fact, you can get targeted for doing that. So, I'm not for a minute wanting to say this is a straightforward situation that we can keep ourselves separate from, especially if the workplace is toxic and there's a lot of backbiting going on, and especially if our boss is doing quite a bit of the playing of favourites and splitting groups, work groups, by doing that. So here we are, the topic of bullying in the workplace. The focus is on gossip and rumouring about the absent person. The concern is how it creates not only, or especially, an unsafe work environment, but it also affects people's reputation, their ability to do their job well, their confidence, their hopefulness that they will be treated well by their colleagues. And, this is a big deal. It's a big deal. If you look at any of the stats on workers' compensation issues, most of them are not to do with physical injury from accidents in the workplace, but actually from emotional injuries from the harm done by colleagues. So, it's a big deal. It's causes a lot of layers of loss and trauma. And also, if somebody is already living at home in a dangerous situation, like a domestic violence situation, and then comes to work and is also bullied, this is a double terror, really. It's terror forming for people. Okay, so I don't think I have to say much more for us to get to know and accept that we can come to some common ground about it. probably what's less easy for us to come to some common ground about at the start of the conversation is that we might ourselves, myself included, be unwittingly bullying others. Now, that's a pretty hard thing for me to even say and admit to myself, and it's because I see myself as a good person. I'm sure you see yourself as a good person and you do anything to help people. That's how I see myself. And yet I know I get caught in speaking things about people I shouldn't be speaking within my work group. Now, I get that debriefing can be necessary and things can happen fast and a lot can be needing to be processed through our workday. But just the particular type of debriefing that is with someone who's also in that workplace and therefore going through their own working through of how to be in that situation, especially if it's directly, explicitly, overtly unsafe for everybody. To debrief with someone who's already in that situation can put an added burden on them, and it may not be safe. Because remember, people aren't feeling safe and people will have divided loyalties and will speak and do whatever they need to do for a bit of recognition with their boss who maybe doesn't recognise them, or to get on the right side of someone so that they don't get bullied. You know, this is not a judgment. This is about me as well, thinking, oh my gosh, can I be sure I'm not bullying? And I actually can't be sure at times that I'm not. So that is very disturbing from my point of view. My professional integrity would be, definitely compromised, as would my reputation. So here we are. What do we do about it? Now, because it's such a complicated topic, and as you see, we're already going in all sorts of layers and twists and turns trying to get into the topic a bit, I actually went to YouTube and had a look at how some of the presenters talk about rumouring in particular, or backbiting, because they are really skilled at putting complex things in more accessible messages. So first of all, let me say that I will put at the end of this talk the people I'm drawing on as examples who give some really useful ways of thinking about particularly backbiting in the workplace, and whether we're receiving backbiting messages from other people telling negative things about people, or whether we're party of doing it ourselves. This is something we all need to reflect on and do what we can to be safe ourselves toward others, and to keep safe from any negative incoming attacks on our own self-esteem and reputation. Okay, so one of the fragments that I started with when I was having a look on YouTube was a fairly brief video by Jordan Peterson. And what he said I thought was really interesting, because while we might be involved in an occasional comment that is negative about someone and you think, oh, why did they say that? And, does the person know they think that? You may be missing the pattern that can happen. And you may not be in all the conversations where those negative aspersions are being cast on that person. So what Peterson says is that there can become a negative halo created, which, is created by the rumours. And it's kind of like people just get into a bit of a groove that this person is, slacking off, or not very friendly because they don't come to lunch or coffee with us, or, has some pretty out there ideas and aren't really what, social work or whatever profession you're in is about. Like, there's so many ways you can have a negative attitude towards somebody. And this negative halo becomes its own self-fulfilling prophecy. So even if you're only in occasional conversation, unwittingly and not necessarily sought by any means, where someone is being negative about an absent person, this negative halo of rumours can be very damaging. And what Peterson said is we've got this kind of, sense of where there's smoke, there's fire. And so we get fragments of information about people. We may not even be working very substantially with them, and those fragments of negative judgments are all we know about the person. Very damaging, very damaging. Gosh, I've seen so many examples of it in my career. It ends up being, in its extreme form, a fairly persistent attacking of a person that leads to scapegoating them out of the staff group. And the people I've given supervision to who are being scapegoated are 9 times out of 10 unable to turn that around and stay within the work group and safe within the work group. 9 times out of 10. The people I have been involved in supporting at those critical times have resigned, and usually with very serious health issues. And then also usually very difficult to get work after that. So scapegoating is an extreme form of what can happen to people, quite apart from the health effects, which are enormous for people. So coming back to Peterson's idea of the negative halo that can be created around the person who's being talked about in their absence, it can also create a negative halo around you if you're the one that always seems to be bad-mouthing somebody. Like, people will get very uncomfortable, unsure about whether they even want to spend time with you. It's not the same because, like your behaviour is, we got to look at that in the first instance, not to take our responsibility away from us. But at the same time, what can happen is there can be crisscross currents of who's being bullied, and in an unsafe environment. 1 minute it could be you, then it could be somebody else, and it could be several people ongoingly. If you're not part of the in-group, the favoured group with your boss, like sometimes that group who's not the individuals, if there's several of you who are not favoured, form their own group. And, depending what you do in that group, if you're on the outer, it can just create another vortex of negative spirals. Here we are. So there's Peterson's idea, which I think is worth considering, whether you're feeling that you've got that negative halo around you because of how people are treating you, even if you can't get your hands on it. That's the whole problem with backbiting. You can't see it. You just have this feeling, and people just seem to be avoiding you or fairly constrained in how they're speaking with you. If someone is treating you badly, even if you can't get your hands on it. Okay, so that's Peterson's idea. Now, the other person who I only watched a little bit of what they were saying on YouTube, but I thought their comment was really interesting, is Galen Emmanuel. And he's the one who made a lot of those comments about the harm to reputational damage. And he said as well, which really resonated for me, that it causes heartache for ourselves as well. Not only reputational damage and harm and heartache to the person who is on the receiving end of being bullied and gossiped about, but also for ourselves. It's not good for our integrity to be talking negatively about people, trying to get that one-up advantage in sometimes understandable, especially if the workplace is very competitive for jobs and promotions and the favour of the boss. Yeah, what I've talked about elsewhere is bowing from the heart. People will bow so low that they compromise their integrity without question. And it can make it really hard for other people to try and hold some honour and some safety in the workplace when others are doing whatever they feel they need to do. And talking negatively about whoever they need to talk about to keep in the favour of the boss. And it can be life and death for people. It can be about trying to keep a job, to feed your family, and so on. I'm not saying there are naive, well, they may be naive, but there are always substantial reasons why people act like they do. Doesn't make it right, though. Okay? And while I'm talking individually about my behaviour, your behaviour, perhaps others, we mustn't forget the context in which this all happens, which is the workplace, which happens also within a broader context of society. And we know we only have to watch Parliament in session to see the negativity and the hostility when a debate is trying to be held. And in all sectors of society, there are poor examples of working through differences and conflict in safe, non-violent ways. So The broader context can be very unconducive. The organisational context itself can be kind of like the best and worst of society. People with the best hearts, but the behaviours, because of the complex pressures, can be really harmful. Perhaps all the more reason that they're harmful is because they're not expected. We don't expect our social work or nursing colleagues or our counselling colleagues to treat each other badly. Because we see ourselves as good people, so it can take a while to get hold of what's going on in the workplace, and any level of unsafety, backbiting, and general lack of care about how the effects of those behaviours are happening can make it really hard then for you as an individual to hold your own integrity in how you act and to resist those behaviours yourself. So an example would be sitting to the lunch table with colleagues is seen to be a convivial thing to do. And yet it can be the most, well, first of all, it can be the most fun and enjoyable place. All sorts of chit-chat can happen and people are sharing lovely stories and interested in each other. But it can also turn quickly to just even off the cuff, quick comment, whatever it is, it can turn quickly and you can be sitting there and be implicated fast in a comment that is negative about someone. And depending on the work context that I was just talking about, you may not feel safe to say, hey, can we not talk about them when they're not here? You may not feel safe to do that. And if you're the only person who does speak up when that's happening, people will find other ways to have those conversations without you in them, which just hides it. It just hides it. It's cold comfort if you've been closed out of those, what I would call careless and disrespectful kinds of comments about people who are absent. Okay, so this idea of heartache, that we don't escape if we're being bullied at work, but it's different order of harm to the person who is being bullied. The other person who I found really interesting on YouTube is Rolferson, and his work is particularly significant because he's done a lot of work at the corporate level of working with the senior members of the organisation to change the organisational culture. And he identifies backbiting as a highly serious issue, a really serious issue in the workplace. And if that can be changed by the whole workplace, all sorts of indicators of well-being and productivity and safety are evident from that. So he's talking out of evidence-based practice, and while his ideas are seemingly really simple, what he's basically recommending is a buy-in of the staff group to the idea. He's kind of talking like about setting up an agreement that staff will no longer gossip about the absent person. And if they've got an issue, they'll take it to the person and speak directly, and that straight talking becomes part of the culture and accepted behaviour in the workplace. Now, it may be that you're not in a position to enable that whole staff group or whole organisational change. Elsewhere in the literature, again by people like Sandra Bloom, it's called trauma-informed organisations. And yet we can, wherever we are, start to do something that may help. And it doesn't finish with us, but it starts with us. We can do something often, not always directly, but what he is suggesting, so what Rolferson is suggesting, is if somebody's approaching you to try this triple filter test, has 3 questions. Now, you may not feel able to do this, but to be actually in your own mind thinking these things as someone's talking to you. And if you answer that no to them, I'll tell you the questions in a minute, even in your own mind, without asking the person, because it may not be safe to ask them, then be on high alert. Be ready to close down that conversation as quickly as you can and to show no interest without getting offside with that person. difficult to do. And I think, in fact, Rolferson underestimates how difficult that is to do. That's why he talks about a whole team change of culture. Okay, now, so what he calls the triple filter test, these are the questions. So to ask the person, if you can, is what you're saying to me true? And if the person says, no, I don't know, or sure, but, doesn't ring true, that alarm bell one goes off. The next question is it a good thing you want to say to me? And the person may again become quite unsure and ambivalent, maybe a bit uncomfortable that you've asked them that question. Gossip is rarely a good thing. And if that question is no, there goes the next red flag of concern from you and your personal or professional integrity. And then Rolferson says the third question, is it useful for you to be telling me this? And again, the useful value is possibly to the person telling you to aggrandize themselves with you in some way. First of all, don't court aggrandizing in that way by anybody, but given that this example is assuming it's happening, and the person says, no, it's nothing really useful for me to be telling you this, then you've got 3 red flags. And they each point to where the harm can come for the person being talked about and for you in receiving that. Now, again, I think Rolferson underestimates in a workplace that doesn't have a collective approach to this, how hard it is to do that. But I do know an example at one of the universities where I worked, and believe it or not, it was the HR human relations team, where I guess we all like to think that they're an incredibly coherent, respectful, safe work group because, they need to be giving advice to staff around issues of bullying and harassment, among other things. Now, I'm aware, and this was after the experiment. It was an experiment, but it was actually a serious workplace change. So it wasn't an experiment in a naive sense. But the staff group were doing a lot of backbiting. Everybody in the different mixes of how they got together through the workday was saying something negative about someone else who wasn't present. And it got to a point where the boss of the HR department was so disturbed and so unable to directly address it, they brought in an external consultant, and a bit like Rolferson's idea, brought the focus to a particular example of the microaggression and asked if people were doing that and people, or was it being done to them, and did they feel unsafe? And the whole workplace admitted that they felt unsafe, that they'd been involved in backbiting other people. And they made a commitment to not do it together. And they helped each other not do it and discouraged it and gave each other permission to discourage any kind of, even just a huff when someone's name is mentioned or a rolling of the eyes, or especially those kind of non-verbals. It all stopped. And it became a very safe, respectful workplace. So it's that collectivizing of the response to the issue is really important. So I'm not underestimating how hard it is as an individual to do something about it. And unfortunately, and I've seen this in the workplace as well, people who try to resist bullying through backbiting and gossiping can often become the target themselves. So, really, this is about challenging the perception that sometimes bullying happens to people who are behaving badly and causing trouble in the workplace or not doing their job properly. Evidence also shows that bullying can happen to highly skilled, competent people with incredibly high professional integrity who don't go to lunch and gossip about people, who don't go to after work parties and try to be friends with everybody, especially the boss. That person who is trying to keep appropriate professional boundaries with their work colleagues can be seen to be a real threat to other people's behaviour, and can become the target of being gossiped about. So, there's nothing simple about this. And in every instance, please don't try if it's happening for you, or you're in an environment that, is just really unsafe for so many people in different ways. It's very important that you don't ignore it. Don't ignore the impact on yourself. Find a safe person. And by safe, I mean it has to be someone outside that immediate work environment, preferably outside the organisation, who is able to hold confidentiality and keep what is being said to them safe. Now, in rural and regional locations, it can be really hard to get safe supervisors because everybody seems to know everybody. And even people coming to know that you're getting your supervision with this supervisor over here can start to put aspersions on them. But also people can go fishing and try to get that supervisor to wittingly or otherwise give information about them. I have certainly had supervisors in my workplace where I used to do a lot of supervision for other work groups in this big organisation come to me fishing for what people were telling me in supervision and putting a whole big elaborate story around that because they're concerned about them and they're wanting to know if they can do anything to help them. But no, what you're doing is really not okay, and I'm not compromising my professional integrity or the confidentiality of the person. It's unfortunate that the supervisor knew that some of the staff were coming to me. That was unfortunate for their confidentiality around that. So it can be really hard to get good supervision. And I know a lot of people rely on their partners at home, and I really get that because sometimes that is the safest place, but it may or may not be enough. So, the principle that I use, and I'm not perfect around this by any means, is keeping my own counsel. And by that I mean sometimes you have to be your own supervisor. Of course, we're meant to do reflective practice to adjust and change our behaviour if it's not got proper integrity around it. But sometimes there isn't a safe person that we can talk to and get our perspective on how to act and get validated and supported. And we have to do that for ourselves. But also, sometimes we have to be the safe container if people are coming to us and if there is a level of distress in the workplace that just won't be contained. You can't ignore it. You can't just kind of put yourself in a little bubble and carry on when people are so distressed. So being the safe person that people can come to, where you hold confidentially what is being said, where you don't let that information prejudice you and how you act, and where you don't betray them in any way, including speaking for them without their permission. So keeping your own counsel is, again, something you need possibly supervision for, but it's kind of like the buck stops here. If someone's going to talk to me, I'll do everything I can to get them to talk about themselves, the I, not the other person, and bring it back to them and what they can do, especially, for example, if they're talking about being bullied, and validating their experiences, etc. But I may have to hold that information. And what I would recommend in that situation is, and I don't always do this myself, because things can go really seriously bad for people. You may need to keep some notes about what's being said, and it's really important that you don't do that in a way where that confidentiality in terms of the notes gets broken. Please be really careful how you do that. But it may be needed at some point to show that you had those conversations about that matter and that you advise this for the person. It doesn't get complicated. So anyway, the topic here is backbiting, made much more complicated in a toxic workplace where it kind of feels and looks like everybody's doing it. But anytime you cannot do it, anytime I cannot do it and resist that temptation to try and make myself feel connected in, especially if I'm not feeling connected in with my work colleagues, matters. It matters. And being sure I'm not the person who doesn't invite the troublemaker to lunch when we're all going to lunch. That's the least I can do. Being sure I don't stay at the table if people are being negative about others, and doing everything I can through my own example to hold good relationships, safe relationships with people. It's a full-time job, an important job, and often a hidden part of what our work's about. Anyway, I hope you found that useful, and those YouTube videos do have some value, but also what I'm hoping you got out of today is how it's complicated. And we can be both the bully and being bullied, and it can be seen, and people can still stand by and not do anything about it, and it can be unseen, invidious. It can go on for years. It's very demoralizing, very harmful. So please, can we do what we can to, in our own actions at the very least, to be safe toward others, to avoid being complicit in other people's behaviour, especially if they're backbiting and gossiping about colleagues. Okay. Happy to hear your comments and have further conversations. Thanks for your time. Thanks a lot. Bye.